From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ed Emmett, one of the fellows here at the Baker Institute. In today's topic, the Texas Attorney General has been impeached by the Texas House of Representatives and is about to go on trial before the Texas Senate. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, powerful, controversial, other terms could be used, but faces a historic impeachment trial in the Senate. First such impeachment of a statewide official in more than a century. For much of his tenure in public office, Paxton has been under a criminal investigation. He's fought legal battles. He's been accused of various wrongdoing, but he has continued to get reelected. Just reelected for his third term as recently as last November. But on May 24th, the Texas House publicly detailed a long list of allegations of a pattern of misconduct and abuse of power and voted overwhelmingly to impeach Paxton. So now on September 5th, the Texas Senate will begin a trial, and that trial will determine whether or not to permanently remove him from office. There's a whole lot to discuss here, and with us today to help make sense of it all is Dr. Mark Jones, fellow in political science at the Baker Institute. Mark, thank you very much for being here.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So, to begin, let's talk about the man at the center of the conflict, Ken Paxton. What do we need to know about him, but specifically, what is he accused of doing?
Well, to start off, so Ken Paxton began his career as a state representative, marking out a territory as being one of the most conservative state representatives early on during the Tea Party movement. He at times challenged moderate Speaker Joe Straus as a way to sort of stake out a territory on the right, and then became a state senator. Then in 2014, he ran for Attorney General. It was an open seat as Greg Abbott was running for governor, and there was quite a bit of competition. And the sort of establishment favorite at the time was a man named Dan Branch, who took Paxton to a runoff, but in that runoff, Paxton defeated him. Now, at that time, there was already percolating these security fraud accusations against the former Attorney General, as well as a host of controversial land deals that were up in Collin County, where he is from. So it wasn't like when Paxton was initially elected, there wasn't controversy, although it was much lower than it is today. Now, in terms of the charges, there were 20 of them altogether. A small number, which the Senate has put aside for now, are related to the securities fraud cases that occurred prior to his first election as Attorney General, and are slowly working their way through the legal system back here in Harris County. It's bounced around between here and Harris County for quite some time as the Paxton team has delayed it. The other charges, and the ones that are most serious, relate to the extent to which Paxton intervened in a variety of ways to benefit a donor as well as someone with whom he has a financial relationship, Nate Paul. Nate Paul's an investor that seems to be something of a grifter and got in legal trouble. Paxton intervened, and in exchange for things that Paxton did for Nate Paul, Paul did some remodeling on his house and provided a job for his, at the time, paramour, who had been fired from her job in the Senate because Paxton's wife, Angela Paxton, who's a senator, found out that they were having an affair.
Oh, my. So it's safe to say that the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, has had a bit of a rocky tenure since taking office 9 years ago. Let's go back to the vote in the House of Representatives on May 24th. That's when these allegations were first publicly made. You talked about some of what they laid out. What was the significance of that vote by the Texas House, reminding everybody that it was a bipartisan vote and it was overwhelming?
Right. So there was sort of two things going on with the vote. One were the charges, and then the other was a strong lobbying effort by the Speaker of the House, Dade Phelan, to ensure that as many Republicans as possible voted for the articles of impeachment. I think there's a strong belief within Republican circles and elite circles that Paxton's an embarrassment, that he's an unnecessary distraction, and he's less effective than he could be because of all of his legal problems. There's been, though, a reluctance among Republicans to try to get rid of him, in part because he is very popular with the base. And Ken Paxton has figured out very clearly the secret to success within Texas politics today. That is, don't let anybody outflank you on the right. maintain the support of the base, win the Republican primary, and then rely on the R next to your name to win the general election. Well, in the House, we saw a large majority of Republicans, in spite of the fact that the base was going to be angry with them, unite together to file the articles of impeachment and vote for them. Only 23 Republicans voted against. Now, part of that is due to, I think, a group effect that they believe that the best thing for the party in the state is that Paxton is no longer Attorney General. The other was, though, that the Speaker, Dade Phelan, was putting a lot of pressure on everybody to vote for the articles of impeachment, lest they run into problems in the future in terms of committee chair positions and legislation.
So, as a former member of the Texas House, I paid a little bit more attention than perhaps some. All the Democrats voted to impeach, is that correct? The way the vote broke down among the Republicans, I thought was very interesting. I'd really like your take on it. For example, all 5 state representatives from the Collin County area, where Attorney General Paxton and his wife, Senator Paxton, still live, all 5 of them voted to impeach. And they are very, very conservative people by and large. And looking at the other votes, it really didn't break down much conservative versus moderate at all.
No, we saw several members of the Freedom Caucus, Briscoe Cain from in Houston, for instance, who's arguably the most conservative or close to the most conservative, voted for it. So yeah, it didn't break down along traditional sort of left-right. You tended to have one group that, for either primary perspective or activist perspective, voted against it. And there were a few Republicans that voted against it more just because they didn't like the way that it came about. That is, that it was so quick, there was no information provided, and they had a few days to vote on it. So it was more a procedural question. But by and large, I think we can say that the House vote was overwhelmingly in favor.
No question about that. You mentioned lack of information, quick process. Is the public paying attention? Is there any public buzz out there about this?
Not really, no. There was a little bit when it was occurring, and there will be once the Senate trial begins, because most of the major media organizations, television, radio, will be sending people to cover the trial. So I think we're going to get more focus on it once we hit September, when it's a feature of the nightly news. And as you mentioned, the last time we had one of these was Paul Ferguson being impeached 100 years ago. So this is a major political event, and it has national significance as well, because Ken Paxton is arguably the biggest legal thorn in the side of the Biden administration at the national level. So there's going to be a lot of national focus on what happens to Paxton. And Donald Trump is strongly supporting Paxton and probably will continue to support him. So that adds another element to the whole drama.
Drama is a good word. We've talked about the House. Let's talk about the Senate. Unlike a normal trial, where the jury is selected from, yes, your peers, but they're also screened so as they don't have any conflicts. It's probably safe to say nearly all the senators know Attorney General Paxton personally, have had dealings with him, pro or con. Their bias is maybe too strong of a word, but they go in with an opinion of him. How's that going to affect this trial? Plus the political aspect. You've talked over and over about how the districts are all drawn pretty much for one party or the other. So what's the breakdown of the Senate, Republican and Democrat? And I think his wife's not allowed to vote, right?
Right. So there are 19 Republicans, there are 12 Democrats. You need 21 votes to impeach. I think we can safely assume that all 12 Democrats are going to vote for impeachment, which means you need 9 Republicans to cross over. While Angela Paxton isn't allowed to vote, she is present, and therefore she's in the denominator. So for all intents and purposes, she has a vote by simply being there. So the thing to watch is, are there 9 Republicans that can be convinced to vote for impeachment? I don't think, though, that it will be a narrow vote. If it's a vote for impeachment, it's not going to be 21-10. It's more likely to be mid to high 20s to a small holdout group. For the senators, it's a difficult position because on one hand, it's tough to ignore the charges. The charges are serious and they're pretty credible. On the other hand, the people who determine election in the Texas Senate are Republican primary voters. All 19 of those senators are in safe Republican seats, which means that they don't have to worry about the November electorate. They really have to worry about Republican primary voters. Now, only 6 of them are up in 2024, which means that they do have a little more breathing space. But I think at the end of the day, this is probably going to be more of a group decision with the lieutenant governor guiding them one way or the other. Because while the lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, is the presiding judge, he also clearly runs the Senate. We're not in the days of David Dewhurst, the former lieutenant governor, where you can make the case that the lieutenant governor really didn't run the Senate. Senators did. Under Dan Patrick, especially Dan Patrick in 2023, Dan Patrick runs the Senate. So even if the lieutenant governor decides not to play a role, he is implicitly playing a role because he's going to let whatever happens happen. And I see sort of three options. One option is they go through the trial and convict and impeach the Attorney General. The second option is they go through the trial and they acquit the Attorney General. The third is that before the trial even gets underway, they hold a vote on something called the forgiveness doctrine. And that relates to, can you impeach someone for actions that occurred prior to the most recent election? In statute in Texas, it's clear that you can't. Now, this, though, is a constitutional impeachment, which means they can do whatever they want to do. But a way out for many of the senators that can't bring themselves to say, absolve him of his crimes because the evidence is too clear, but don't want to impeach him for political reasons, would be to say, well, it's beside the point whether he did this or not. This all occurred prior to his most recent election. And as a result, we therefore cannot impeach him on this. It's actually an important point because from the House's perspective, everything that he's accused of, with one possible exception related to retaliation, but realistically, everything he's accused of was known prior to the 2022 election cycle, especially among Republican elites. I think you can make the case that November voters had no idea about most of this. Republican primary voters, I think, were better informed. Certainly, Louis Gohmert, Eva Guzman, and George P. Bush spent a lot of time talking to Republican primary voters, reminding them of all of Paxton's misdeeds, from the securities fraud allegations to abuse of power to the extramarital affairs to the Collin County land deals to stealing a pen in the Collin County courthouse, not to mention all of his trouble with the Texas bar related to the attempt to overturn the elections in 2020. But when you put all that together, that was still all known prior to the election.
That's true, but I consider myself a fairly informed voter. I don't think I'd ever heard of Nate Paul. And Nate Paul, of course, is the person that the Attorney General is accused of intervening on behalf of. Does that make a difference? And Nate Paul, has he been indicted?
He's been indicted, and his case may or may not be over prior to the Attorney General's case. No, I think if we're talking about, did the voters actually know? No, most voters were not aware of it. But was the information in the public domain? Yes, it all was. The accusations were there that he had essentially been engaged in abusive power and retaliation against whistleblowers. That was all there, and the Republican primary voters said, we don't care. He's conservative, he's aligned with Trump, and they overwhelmingly, by a 68% to 32% vote, voted for him over George P. Bush. And then in the November election, he defeated Democrat Rochelle Garza by 10%. Now, in the November election, I think we know that the electorate didn't really know what was going on, but that's not how the forgiveness doctrine works. The forgiveness doctrine says if the event occurred prior to their election and then they were elected, it's one of those strategies that if you're Republican senators and you're looking for a way to effectively not have to make a decision, that's the route that you would choose.
Okay, put your political expert hat on. What would be the blowback if the Senate said, oh, never mind, we're not going to pursue it? I mean, won't that be kind of lost on the public? Won't it just look like the Senate decided to just sweep it under the rug?
Yeah, it will, but the question is, will that have an impact in November of 2024? At this point, what's the blowback going to be? All the state Senate seats are safe Republican. Of the Texas House seats, all but about 6 or 7 that the Republicans hold are safe. U.S. House seats, there's one that's maybe vulnerable.
If the Attorney General is either acquitted or doesn't ever go to trial, what happens to those House members that voted to impeach him?
One of the advantages that the House members have is they have safety in numbers. There are enough of them that not all of them can be primaried in March of 2024. They're already, though, they're going to be a group that are going to have targets on their back. If he isn't impeached, then they're going to be even more vulnerable because now they have the sitting Attorney General who's out to get them, plus all of his supporters. So I think a significant number of them will receive primary challenges. Not all of them, because one, even in the heyday of the group that's primarily challenging them is sort of the conservative wing, backed by the Wilkes brothers out of Cisco and former fracking billionaires and Tim Dunn out of Midland. Even in their heyday, the best they could usually do is probably challenge 15 to 20 because they still have to field high quality candidates and fund them. So it's not going to be targeting all approximately 60 Republicans, but there will be a half dozen to a dozen, maybe a dozen and 20 who do get challenged. And it's going to be worse for them if Paxton is still Attorney General.
Before we talk about the potential trial itself, because you used the word drama, and boy, that is going to be drama or circus, depends on how you look at it. There really hadn't been a good across the state scandal since Sharpstown back in the early 70s, where the next session of the legislature, 76 members of the House were freshmen newly elected. So you don't see this becoming a statewide scandal.
No, I think if the senators acquit or essentially avoid it, nothing will happen to them in the Republican primary. And I think even if they do vote to impeach, they're going to be doing so with the tacit approval of the lieutenant governor, which means that there's also, there's not going to be any blowback.
Since you mentioned the lieutenant governor several times, there is some conversation among the Austin lobby and others that the House would never have done the impeachment without actually talking to Lieutenant Governor Patrick first. What's your theory on that? Did he know it was coming and sort of give a tacit, okay, go ahead, or not?
I would have to assume that it was at least broached with him. Whether he gave them a full signal, I don't know. I think, though, if we go back to the fact that despite having strong agreement on property tax relief during the entire regular session, the Senate and the House couldn't come to an agreement on that. I'm not sure how involved the lieutenant governor would have been in sort of impeachment discussions. That is, I would be surprised if he wasn't at least briefed on it, but I also would be surprised if he essentially signed on the dotted line informally saying, yeah, that sounds good. I mean, I think he was briefed, but that was probably about it.
A bit of inside politics that I guess the general public's not aware of. Lieutenant Governor Patrick has been known to actively get involved in senators' campaigns one way or the other. There was a local state senator who was basically told, don't run again. If you do, I'm going to be against you. Is this the kind of issue that would get him that involved?
The lieutenant governor's remade the Senate in his own image. So over time, either by primarying people such as John Corona from up in Dallas or Bob Deuel from East Texas, or like with Larry Taylor, as you mentioned, here in Houston, pushing them aside. Craig Estes, he primaried up in Wichita Falls, drove Kel Seliger out. So I think where the lieutenant governor can play a role is that if the decision is to impeach and the lieutenant governor is at least in tacit agreement with that, he can protect every one of those senators from a Republican primary challenge. That is, they don't have to worry about it. He can intervene both monetarily but also just politically by telling the Wilkes brothers and Tim Dunn, it's like, no, this is a decision. And at the end of the day, I think for the Republican Party, the best thing for the Republican Party, and I think most Republican elites, would be that Ken Paxton goes, because he's an embarrassment and he's less effective than he could be. It's just one of the ironies is no Republican had, up until Speaker Phelan this past May, had the gumption to actually try to do it. And I think one thing that we also have to keep in mind is in 2022, Republican elites from the governor on down had a perfect opportunity to try their best to get rid of Ken Paxton via the primary process, which is ideally the way you try to do it. Texans for Lawsuit Reform took the lead on Dick Weekly, and they supported Eva Guzman and did everything possible to try to defeat Paxton. But at that time, the lieutenant governor endorsed the attorney general, and Governor Abbott stayed out of it completely, and most Republicans stayed on the sidelines. A few of them endorsed other people, but that was probably the best time to get rid of him, but they weren't able to do it. So now they've got themselves in this sort of pickle where they're trying to do it via the impeachment process, but that's far more complicated.
Okay, so in just the few minutes we have left, let's talk about if there is a trial, because one of the unique features of this are the outside attorneys that have been brought in on both sides. You want to comment about it? Because these are high-profile, well-known trial lawyers on each side.
All right, so we have Dick Garin, Rusty Harden on the prosecution side. And then we have Dan Cogdell and Tony Buzbee defending the Attorney General. They're high profile, they're media savvy. I think probably Paxton has the stronger team in the sense that Garin and Harden were great attorneys, but they're in their 80s. And so they're not going to be as effective as someone like Tony Buzbee, who's in his prime.
Well, it's also interesting to me that you mentioned Rusty Harden, Dick Garin. They're both defense attorneys. They're not really prosecutors. And that struck me as kind of an odd choice to make.
Well, yeah, I think what they were doing is they were going for the name recognition. They're very effective. They're very good. They're very well known. They know their craft. But you're right, they aren't prosecutors. Busby's the type of person as a defense attorney who's quite good at his job. And he's in his prime. So he's still working hard and firing on all cylinders. So I think probably Paxton's in shape there. I think the concern, though, that you run into with these huge egos and these huge personalities is that they overshadow the trial itself. That is, people will start talking about Garin and Harden and Cogdell and Buzbee, and they forget the fact that it's Ken Paxton on trial. And at the end of the day, it's also a very strange trial in that they're used to working with juries. This isn't a real jury. This is 31 politicians who are going to make a political-based decision more than anything else.
So, put you on the spot here at the end. What's going to happen? And what's going to be the long-term impact?
Well, I mean, I would say that there's two options. The option of acquittal via actual trial acquittal, which I think that's the least likely. That is, I think if the goal is to acquit, they're probably going to try to squeeze their way out by saying, well, none of these charges apply. Because it's going to be tough to go through that entire trial process and then say, okay, he didn't do any of these things, because it's just, the evidence is too strong. So I think if they're going to acquit, I think if we get to trial, that is, if they don't immediately say and dismiss the charges, then I think the most likely scenario is impeachment.
And will there be any long-term effect on Texas politics?
No.
In the 2024 election even?
Well, if he's impeached, no, because most Republicans want him gone. They just aren't going to say that publicly. So once he's impeached, he's just going to be out there. I think then, though, he's going to start running into some criminal issues. And we'll have to see if his moneyed backers continue to provide funding for his legal fund. So, I mean, the Wilkes brothers and Tim Dunn and the Darwin Deason and such, Kenny Trout, they can provide as much money as he needs, but will they continue to do that if he's no longer Attorney General? I guess only time will tell.
Great. This has been very interesting, very informative. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Production assistance was provided by intern Lisa Jacob. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. And thank you for listening.